G'day, Greg Murphy here with another episode of The Depot, brought to you by my good friends at AutoSense. And today I'll be talking to Paul Gaynor, who is the General Manager of Logistics Safety Solutions. We've spoken briefly in other episodes about the chain of responsibility, and Paul is an absolute expert in COR in Australia and has developed a product called Core Safe with Logistics Safety Solutions. And so he is an expert on this, and we've decided to pull him in and get a bit more detail around the chain of responsibility, how it's working in Australia, and how he sees it being implemented into New Zealand. Hey, thanks, Paul, for joining us today on The Depot. I know it was a bit short notice as well, so I really appreciate you moving your schedule around to have a chat to us. Actually, you've just got back to Australia from a recent trip to New Zealand, talking about the subject that we're going to discuss today, chain of responsibility. Did you have a good trip?
Fantastic trip. It was great to see the trucking industry coming together in a summit. The two associations did a fantastic job and very professional, tackled the right issues. Very impressed. It was a great couple of days for networking and also getting to see what's sort of happening in the industry, both from a compliance and emissions, regulatory. It was really good.
We'll come back to what you think about New Zealand and where we're at with this later on. First up though, it would be great to get a little bit of a background story about yourself and how you've ended up where you are.
Oh, thanks, Greg. Well, I guess that my career started, in my 20s. I was asked to start up a trucking association in Australia. And I was CEO of that for 10 years. It was initially called National Transport Federation, eventually became NatRoad. During that time, because of there were a couple of really bad bus and truck accidents in the late 80s, all the associations got together and we formed the Australian Trucking Association, which is now the peak association in Australia. And I was a founding member of that for many years. I also set up the Victorian Livestock Transporters Association, which was interesting because I became a vegetarian during that time. So it was pretty interesting going to livestock carrier association meetings as a vegetarian, but they were very accepting, I must say. They were very, very gracious. And then after 10 years of that, I became general manager of a trucking company called Bunker Freight Lines. We had about 120 singles, B doubles and road trains doing interstate express work in Australia every night. And my job there was to clean up the backyard over a few years. And because compliance was becoming real, and the owner, Ron Bunker, really understood that, the old days of saying whatever it takes to get it done had to be replaced by whatever it takes to get it done safely. And that was our mantra. And we were able to get that company, which, in the toughest of sectors, being the Interstate Express, we're able to get that to really embrace that safety culture, which was just such a fabulous journey to be on with them. After that, after a few years, I left that and then basically sat on boards of advice for trucking companies in Australia. And then along came chain of responsibility into road transport law in Australia. And I was literally sitting down with one of my trucking company clients and Foster's, which was then Foster's, and they asked what I knew about COR. And being a consultant, I said I know everything about COR. And then they asked if I could help them manage it. So I ran away and found someone who actually knew what they were talking about. And we built a system which is now called Core Safe, COR Safe. And my company is Logistics Safety Solutions that I started up in 2008.
Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, you've had a life involved in the supply chain and the transport industry. So many learnings, so much wealth of knowledge through that whole period of your life. And on top of everything, Paul, last year you went through a bit of an ownership change with LSS. One of the big insurers ended up purchasing you.
Yes, indeed. It was a very exciting part of our evolution as a business. National Transport Insurance, which is the leading truck insurer and marine insurer in Australia. I think they insure about 25,000 trucking companies in Australia. Wow. Purchased my business last August, and we've known each other for a long time since I started the Trucking Association. They've got a passion for safety, obviously. And it was just a really nice fit. They have a passion for safety. We're all about trying to make safety manageable, and they saw fit to purchase me. It's kind of a bit daunting to look at the screen now, whereas there used to be about 3 staff, there's now 10 staff. They've invested heavily, very heavily in the business to take us to that next generation. And it's just a real privilege to be involved with such a great culture. They're a great bunch of people, and they really have a passion for this, and they're putting their weight behind the business. So it's just been amazing. So we're working very much on the next generation of the platform, next generation of the services that we provide in-house and via the platform for trucking companies, for customers of trucking companies, a real whole supply chain approach. So I'm very excited about the next stage and looking forward to being part of that journey with them.
Well, excited, but also proud, and I think great to be acknowledged for all obviously the hard work you've done to create the platform that you have, and them realizing that, what you've done, there's no point in going and trying to do it themselves. It must be a fantastic feeling to see that they looked at it and realized that it was worth, putting an offer in to buy your business.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I must admit, I was very proud, and we've always had a great team within LSS, and to have that acknowledged through the purchase was really, really quite special. And it's because I respect NTI so much, to have them express an interest and see that through and invest so heavily. Yeah, it makes it worthwhile in a lot of ways, and knowing it's in good, safe hands, and that the people we work with are now going to be working with a bigger, professional, forward-thinking team. It's just a great feeling, and luckily I can still be part of that journey. So I'm looking forward to that too. Tell
us a little bit then about LSS, Logistics Safety Solutions. You said someone asked you about COR, you didn't know anything about it. You went off and did some research and everything, and then you formed this company to provide the supply chain industry with the information and the tools online solutions that they need to do it. I mean, it must have been an ever evolving too kind of learning process, putting that together, and it will continue to be, I'm assuming too.
Absolutely. I mean, the way chain of responsibility, and just to explain, chain of responsibility is a concept that is used in a number of areas of law, environmental law, safety law, and the concept basically spreads responsibility for an activity from the party actually conducting the activity, like a trucking company, to any other party that has a controlling influence over that activity, and particularly the customers, in this case, the customers of trucking companies. So in about 2006, the authorities in Australia introduced the concept of COR into road transport law. And it basically means that the carriers always have the primary responsibility for safety, but it means that customers of trucking companies now share responsibility with their trucking companies that they engage for the safety and compliance of any trucks operating within that supply chain. So to give you a typical example, one of my clients in Australia is Nestle. They have about 90 carriers that they engage. They've got about 150 suppliers. If they engage a supplier to bring raw materials to them, and that supplier engages a carrier to deliver those raw materials, and if the load's not restrained properly when it leaves the supplier site to go to a Nestle site and the load falls off and kills 3 people, the authorities can now line up the carrier, the supplier, and Nestle and say, ask the question, what did you all do to minimise or eradicate the risk of that occurring? If they can't answer that, they could be implicated in that accident. If they can answer it, it means that there still may be accountabilities, but it won't actually come into their environment because they did everything possible. But it still happened. And it could have been an act of God, or it could be mismanagement at some point in time. But it just means that everyone in the supply chain needs to work together now through COR. And in 2018, the authorities really ramped it up by increasing the fines. So for a company now in Australia, the maximum fine is $3 million for an incident. And for individuals, it's gone up from 15,000 to 300,000 and up to 5 years jail. So it's a very serious risk within supply chains. It's definitely on the radar of boards of directors of any party in a supply chain. And it needs to be managed. And that's the intent of the legislation. And it certainly had that intent. I don't think it's had amazing impact on the culture, because it's really meant that customers of trucking companies now have a risk they need to manage, and they need to work with their supply chain partners to manage those risks.
If you could probably just tell us, Paul, what aspects of trucking supply chain, COR is contributed to or contributes to it.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned before that trucking companies obviously always carry primary responsibility for truck safety, but what COR does is calls out specific activities that now have a supply chain focus and a shared responsibility, and that's axle and gross weights, dimensions, load restraint, fatigue management, speeding, and equipment maintenance in Australia, and drugs and alcohol as part of the driver fitness for duty. In New Zealand, it's likely to cover the same areas. Plus, in New Zealand, you've got operator licensing. So in New Zealand, it's likely to cover the same elements as Australia, and perhaps one extra one, which is just making sure the whole supply chain is accountable for proper operator licensing or the use of licensed operators.
So you mentioned that they increased the fines, obviously massively, 2018. What brought that about? What was the impetus for them to actually look over, obviously, a period of time leading up to that, to then go and take such a big step, considering that COR had been rolled out into the supply chain industry, over 10 years before that?
I'm not exactly sure. I mean, the idea of COR basically, I think before COR, when there was an incident, people were sort of pointing at each other saying, no, it's the carrier's fault. No, it's the customer's fault. No, it's someone else's fault. And in the end, the authority said, you know what, you're all in this together. You're all at fault, basically, unless you prove that you're not at fault. And that's a debate in itself, the way the legislation works. But I think there was also, when it was initially introduced, it was seen as a road transport problem, not a safety problem. And I think there was a real demarc between safety teams and sort of road transport supply teams. I'm not sure whether that was the motive for the 2018 reforms, but what the reforms did was introduce safety language into the legislation, introduce safety liabilities such as primary duties, and introduce fines which were aligned to the safety level of fines. So since 2018, safety teams within businesses have been very engaged, because the language,
put them on notice, right? They put them on a bigger notice again, I suppose. It's
made it really obvious that this is there shouldn't be a demarc between safety and supply chain or trucking. It is about safety, and everyone needs to get engaged.
It's interesting too. I think this is where Australia, personally, just through my experience, and I lived there for 18 years. If I reference, for example, just simple things like driving and having your cell phone in your hand. I remember getting pulled over. I'm talking, it was like 2009 or something. It was a long time ago. 2010, let's say, right? So that's 12, 13, 14 years ago when I was living in Australia, getting pulled up because a police officer saw me with my phone in my hand, pulled me over, and it was black and white. And I had it in my hand. And I remember the fine back then being like $400 and demerit points on my license. And here in New Zealand, it's still pathetic. Like I think it went up a year or so ago to maybe $150 or something. I actually don't even know if there's demerits or not, but it's still that being deterred. I think it's much stronger in Australia. And I think also then, from what you've said about 2018, that action to actually just create, a bit of like, wow, we need to really do something about this, because it's becoming now, a very serious offence, and the fines and the possibility of jail time, all that kind of stuff, is making everyone stand up and take notice. And I think that's a big difference between what we've got here. And again, with COR still not really, well, it's not, is it? It's not engaged into the transport industry or the supply chain industry anywhere near close to what it is in Australia, is it?
No, look, in Australia, it's very upfront in the legislation in Australia for heavy vehicles. It's really obvious. Whereas in New Zealand, you have to search to find it, and it's also spread between the Land Transport Act and the Workplace Health and Safety Act in New Zealand. So it's kind of like half a bit of it's here and a bit of it's there. One of the great things about the conference on the weekend was, definitely there's a real desire by the regulators, the authorities, and the industry, being the trucking industry at this stage, to make COR front and centre in the Land Transport Act, and to then have a scheme to guide parties in supply chains to understand what they need to do to manage COR. So, I mean, one of the things about COR, it sounds a bit sort of scary, but a lot of it is already being done in practice. It just needs to be formalised. And what it's done, the scheme that we're involved with, that we roll out with our clients, it clarifies the duties that need to be managed. So that's the first thing, because before that, it was a guess.
Yep.
And secondly, it provides assistance on how to manage those duties. COR law in Australia is not prescriptive. It's what they call performance-based law. And it basically says, look, you'll get these awful penalties if you don't comply, but we'll leave it up to the courts and the regulators to determine on a case-by-case basis what it means to comply. So it left a lot of ambiguity initially. And then in 2018, the regulator introduced a code of practice, which gave a lot of clarity on what it expected to see, in a COR management system. So, our system is fully aligned to that regulator's view, as are most of the other leading COR systems in Australia. And so it's evolved, and everyone's learning as we go along. It's similar to safety legislation, where it took a while to sort of crystallise what best practice means, what excellence meant. And there's a clear understanding of safety, and that understanding is evolving in the COR space.
From what you see, from where we are at here in New Zealand, could your product LSS be pushed into being utilised quite easily, quickly in New Zealand?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We've already started. We've got a number of clients that are rolling out CoreSafe in New Zealand.
Yep.
And what it's about is, our clients in New Zealand are consignors. They're not trucking companies. They're the customers of trucking companies, and they're reaching out to themselves for what they do internally, and they're reaching out to their supply chain partners to say, look, we want to apply at this stage, it's a best practice approach in New Zealand rather than necessarily a legislative requirement, but they're basically saying, look, we want to roll this out. It's a best practice, truck safety system, and we want you to get engaged and help us. So that's already started, and we're learning from that as we go. So we've written a New Zealand version of our system, and we're now rolling that out.
Yeah, right. Well, so what was when you were made aware of COR, when Foster's went and said, hey, you're an expert, to help us out here. When you went off and started to understand it and learn about it, what did you see as the initial impacts on the supply chain industry in Australia? How did they react when it was realised that we really need to get our act together here and start thinking about this? I mean, how much pushback, how much sort of negativity, or was there much sort of on the initial rollout?
Yeah, it was really interesting actually, because the way we started was that we wrote an audit checklist, and Foster's asked us to audit their 10 largest carriers, and I think they were the first COR audits in Australia, and and they were major players, they were major trucking companies, and we ddid the audits and we presented the findings, and I always remember being hauled into the corporate office of a trucking company and absolutely being screamed at. The inference that we were making them accountable. It was extraordinary, really. And they argued, but they couldn't argue with the results. They just argued with about the accountability that came from the results. And so, yeah, it was a really interesting initial reaction. But then Foster's, to their credit, really liked it, and they expanded it. And then they asked us to convert like an Excel spreadsheet audit checklist to an online version, so the parties could self-audit before they were externally audited. And then we're asked to write a standard, so we wrote a standard so parties knew what they were going to be audited against. And then we're asked to write an online e-learning platform so that we could help them with the training of their personnel and their supply chain partners to explain what COR was and how to manage it. So the system sort of evolved from an Excel spreadsheet audit checklist to a pretty complex online system. We've got an e-learning platform. We've got about 14,000 of our clients' personnel doing COR awareness training through our platform. We've got what we call a register, which is where carriers can go online and do a self-audit to confirm the degree to which they're managing their duties. And we've got about 4,000 parties doing with self-audit scores in the system. And our clients use that visibility to assess, whether the degree to which their supply chain partners are managing their duties. And we built some other online tools to basically help our clients and their supply chain partners manage their key duties. So, we've got about 70 supply chains now in Australia. They're pretty senior brands like Mars and Nestle and Treasury Wines and Fonterra and Tip Top Bakeries and those sorts of large supply chains. And they're using our system to reach out to their supply chain partners and to their own internal business units, like their loading, unloading sites, so that everyone has a clear understanding of what their duties are and how to manage those duties, and to get them to confirm the degree to which they're managing those duties. Because obviously everyone's in this together, and everyone wants to see that they're getting to that 100% score. That's the desired outcome.
Yeah. How much of the supply chain in New Zealand then would now already, albeit a long way behind Australia, would already have a pretty good system in place that is doing the job now?
That's a tricky one. I think there'd be an awareness of COR. I just think because people are naturally wanting to do the right thing, there'd be a lot of good practices in the industry. A lot of what we do is about formalising the informal. It's about saying, look, you may think you understand what you need to do, but we can actually give you clarity, and we can then assess how you're going against that clarity. So when you get involved with a client, there's always been a lot of good work done, but it may be in some areas, and there may be some gaping holes. And our job is to make sure there are no gaping holes, that there's a top-down, end-to-end management system for COR, and that there's no ambiguity about the duties. There's no ambiguity about how to manage those duties, and that everyone's accountable for confirming that they're doing their part.
Yeah, so you shouldn't, if tomorrow, there was, legislation was reinforced, and there was a date put on it that we're going to start to be, controlling, regulating, and auditing from this point on to enforce COR at a proper operational level. It shouldn't be anything like what it was when it was introduced and announced really in Australia. I mean, we've got half a clue. We just haven't really gone ahead and put it all into, a proper practice.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I go back to the point again, whenever we engage with a new client, there's, we always do what we call a process review up front, which is, here is a list of the duties. Tell us how you're managing those duties currently. And they'll fall into three categories. Either they're fantastic and we just crystallize those, or they might need improvement, or they might need first aid, they might need deep surgery. So and from a risk management point of view, having that clarity about what needs to be managed, and then number two, exploring how that needs to be managed, gives everyone some comfort that, it's not as bad as you might initially think. But those areas where there are gaps could be the part that, that brings us all down. So that's the beauty of the regulators code in Australia and our ability to apply that code so there's clarity, whereas people are second guessing what needs to be done.
Out of if we try and put a score on out of 1 to 10 in Australia, from when you first got introduced to COR to where they are today, how do you think the performance is across the board from the people that you deal with and your knowledge in the industry? How do you think Australia is operating in a 1 out of 10?
Oh, look, if I go back to the days, the late, when I was at Bunkers in the 90s, I would have said that over 50% of the industry was, I wouldn't say it was out of control, but it wasn't being well managed. I really believe it's, the introduction of COR has been one of the biggest cultural shifts in supply chain in Australia. What it's done is put truck safety front and centre on the radar of every board of directors of every party that operates that has supply chain involvement in Australia. So there's no major corporate in Australia that is involved in road transport that shouldn't be aware that this is a major risk with major fines that needs to be managed. And there are so many good people in the industry that just need that corporate support to manage it. And I've just been so impressed with the people that we deal with. Everyone wants to maximise safety. Yep. They just need the tools to do it and the budget to do it. And this has really made it important to do that. So these days, I'm always a great believer in the 20-60-20 rule. There are 20% that are just best practice, shiny examples of what this should be like. There are 60% that are getting there.
Yep. And
there may be 10-20% that just don't want to engage. They're not interested. They think it's nonsense. They don't think they should be accountable. You're always going to have the tail, but in Australia, I think that 80% is really leading the charge now. So the dog's wagging the tail. There's always going to be exceptions, but what I see is just a huge amount of effort, and they just need a bit of guidance. And that's a far cry from the days when you used to talk to customers about safety in the 80s and 90s, and they would just tell you to shove it. And they really didn't have a lot of respect for the trucking game, and they treated them as servants, and it was a race to the bottom for pricing. And a lot of those things have changed. It's a much more respectable industry, if I can put it that way, with respectable people, and which I think is going to help greatly in career enhancement in the industry, because you can come in there knowing that it's a professional industry rather than the reputation it used to have.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that too, because I think that's and that's a discussion that we have a lot, and we've had that quite a bit with on the other podcast that we've done on the depot as well, is just reinforcing, but also creating that awareness of the importance really to just normal everyday people are going about their business, how important the transport industry, the supply chain network is, and the people that are working in it to ensure that you turn up wherever you go to buy something off the shelf, wondering or knowing how it got there, and the job it took and the process it took to allow that to happen. So I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, it needs to be respected. It needs to be put on a pedestal, as far as I'm concerned, to give it the acknowledgement that it deserves. So that's really good. Just back to when this started to be implemented in Australia. I mean, do you know of or recall sort of early on in the piece when there might have been some sort of prosecution that was done, or someone was held accountable under the COR legislation, and then how that I suppose affected and created the change to maybe a recent possible prosecution that has happened for some kind of breach?
Yeah, look, it's a really important point. It's and no matter how much goodwill there is, if there's not stick, if there's not a consequence, then it starts to fall off the priority list. Because people will say, well, there's a risk, but it's not real, and we don't. Therefore, we can put our money to something else.
Yep.
So the partnership with regulators and enforcement and prosecutions is really important. There's been some really important prosecutions in Australia, and just to give you an example of a few, one of the areas that there's shared responsibility for in supply chains is dimensions. And there was a company in Australia that was engaged to pick up waste from a building site. They engaged a carrier to deliver a tipper to the site. The tipper trailer was loaded too high, and when it went off the site into the M5 tunnel, the debris, the load hit the ceiling of the tunnel, and debris went everywhere. And there's photos of footage of this, and I'm amazed there were no motorists put at risk. But it caused a shutdown of the M5 tunnel in Sydney, which is one of the major tunnels. And the authorities went after the party that was engaged, the consignor and the carrier, and they prosecuted them successfully under COR for failing to manage their dimensions duties. So it not only went after the carrier that was involved, but it went after the customer that engaged the carrier, and they prosecuted both.
Wow.
And they also had to pay for all the damage of the tunnel, by the way. And that's dimensions. In load restraint, there was a really important case where...
When do you know when that was, the year, that first one with the tunnel, by any chance?
Must have been 6 or 7 years, I'm guessing.
Yep.
There was one in load restraint that we always use as an example here, where an import in Australia, there was an importer of timber. They used to import timber, or they do import timber in containers from overseas. In this case, a container was put on a truck in Melbourne. There was a load of timber in the container, but it wasn't fully loaded and it wasn't properly restrained. So when the truck went round a long bend, the load shifted, the container fell off the truck and landed on a car, killing one occupant and badly injuring the other. And the authorities didn't go after the carrier because it was a sealed container. They went after the importer successfully and prosecuted them under COR for failing to make the overseas supplier aware that they had load restraint duties for bringing containers into Australia.
Wow.
And failing to check that they were complying with those duties. So this was an importer prosecuted for failing to make their overseas suppliers aware that they had duties in Australia for load restraint. And so all of our clients now reach out to the
examples, right? Perfect examples of that, the layers and that chain. It wasn't the obvious person, which was the truck or the transport operator.
Yeah,
that would normally be the one that would be held account.
If the trucking company had been able to assess the condition of the load within the container, but in this case, sealed container, the authorities wisely said, well, you didn't have a controlling influence because it was sealed, but the importer did because it engaged the supplier. And, what was the clarification about the supplier's responsibilities? So that was a really important one. And in mass management, there was a company that was engaged by a local council to deliver mulch. They loaded a carrier at their sites, and the carrier's trucks kept getting caught overloaded on the roads, on public road bridges. The authorities went back to the loading agent that had been engaged by the council, and they found that they were systematically overloading the trucks, not necessarily to breach their duties, but just to maximise payload in basically and turning a blind eye to their duties. And they fined the loading agent $1.2 million for ongoing overloading of those trucks. So in the mass management axle and gross weight space, that was a very important test case. There's another case going on at the moment where a truck rolled over on a pedestrian crossing with a container, again, because the load in the container shifted, and that's being prosecuted at the moment. And again, coming out of this important case will be more clarification of what the courts expect to see as an appropriate way of managing load restraint where you've got a container from overseas involved. So there's a lot of interest in that case.
Wow. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, but as I say, it highlights. It's just where the responsibility might seem obvious, it is not necessarily obvious. So it sounds like the prosecutor's doing a very good job of actually highlighting, just the diversity there of where the blame can lie, which is really interesting.
Yeah, hey, I think it just shows that that the COR concept is valid, because in these cases there are parties other than the trucking company that are engaged, that are involved. They have a controlling influence, and they haven't managed their responsibilities, so they should be implicated where they fail to manage the risks involved. And that's the purpose of COR, is to make everyone aware that they have a shared responsibility and they need to exercise that duty.
Yeah, absolutely. I've only started to really understand a little bit more about this only since we've started doing the podcast, and it's a really interesting space. I don't know why I'm really quite interested in understanding about it, and it's been amazing listening to you and getting that wider view and also an experienced view, considering where Australia is at the moment. So with that in mind, and this is probably a little bit of an opportunity for you there to push LSS a little bit and Core Safe as well. But just to finish up, tips for New Zealand businesses to get more prepared for COR in our country?
Well, thank you. The key is to understand what needs to be managed and understand how to manage it. And that's the journey we've been on as the legislation has become more mature in Australia. So is our system. So you learn as you go along and you evolve, and it's a pretty mature system now. Core Safe is well accepted. It's used by a number of leading supply chains and their partners in the supply chains. It helps them write up the processes they need. It helps them train the personnel. It helps them check on the proper management of COR throughout their supply chains. We've built a number of tools with a number of really smart supply chains. So we're very interested to see what's happening in New Zealand. Our clients in Australia that have coverage in New Zealand are wanting to bring best practice into New Zealand.
Yep.
We're doing that now through the introduction of our system in New Zealand with 3 leading supply chains. And look, we'd love to help out if any parties need to work out what it is they need to manage and how they need to manage it. It's not as scary as it sounds, but it does require a systematic approach, and it gives them real protection. So, I know we're one of a number, but we'd love to be involved.
And with that, if they are, your website is?
www.logss.com.au. So it's been a pleasure being involved, Greg. Thank you. It's been
mate.
Nice to have a chat.
As I said, short notice, we really appreciate it. Very interesting chat. Again, has expanded my understanding and knowledge. So we really appreciate your time. Cheers, Paul.
Thank you very much. Cheers.
Well, again, thanks to Paul Gaynor for coming on the depot and talking to us about something that is going to become a lot more important in New Zealand in the near future. So make sure you do share this podcast around. And for those like me who needed to understand a little bit more about chain of responsibility, Paul does a great job of explaining that. So hopefully it does assist. Thanks to AutoSense for sponsoring this podcast, The Depot. If you like what you have heard today, subscribe to the podcast so you'll get alerts each time a new episode is released. If you have something you'd like us to talk about, or if you'd like to come onto the depot to have a chat with me about something, then get in touch. Just email thedepot@autosense.co.nz. And until next time, be safe out there.